welcome, welcome, welcome. It's the second time I get to be here virtually with you all. Thank you so very much for joining us for our Nurture the Soul. I am your host today, the Reverend Ellie Hutchison, and I am the Minister for Congregational and Community Engagement with the Faith Info team. And we are a part of the Love of Church at the national setting of the United Church of Christ. I use they, them pronouns and have a blonde pixie haircut, and I am wearing beaded Native American multicolored earrings along with a light mint green t-shirt with some beautiful artwork from a Palestinian artist. Nurture the Soul is a weekly webinar that provides our local churches and faith practitioners with multitudes of practical education, innovative and formational resources to engage with the critical topics of our time, to center the care and the education for all people of God, from cultural and community organizing to congregational leadership, from worship and theology to resourcing our small and rural churches, from ministry with youth and children to a wide range of justice issues. We feature guest artists, authors, pastors, preachers, theologians, biblical scholars, and key leaders. Nurture the Soul stays current with how the gospel is alive for each of us at this time. We hope that this is a space of connection, community, and nurture because we believe in the collective movement towards a world that God imagines for all of us. And so we invite you to join us every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our regular Nurture the Soul series. And during this post-election season, we have many special offerings coming to you on Mondays at 3:30 p.m. We have a ton of other webinars as well, and so you can find a full list of upcoming digital program offerings at our website, www.ucc.org/events, or on any of our social media platforms. And beloveds, if the conversations that you hear during these webinars offer some kind of ministry or nurture to you or your community, please do consider donating towards the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting the letters UCC to the numbers 41444. It is your prayerful and financial support that helps programs like this continue to do the essential work of the United Church of Christ. Thank you for joining us today. But before I introduce you to this week's guest, I want to remind you where two features we're encouraging you to use throughout today's webinar are. They are at the bottom of the screen, and they are your chat feature. It is a dialogue bubble with 3 dots in the middle. We invite you to share where you're zooming in from today and or to continue the conversation with each other. There's also the Q&A feature found at the bottom as well. Also a dialogue bubble, but this time with a question mark. We will have some time to cover your questions at the end. If you're an internal processor and it takes you a day or so or a week or so or whatever, we hope that you continue to have what you learned today. You get to ruminate on it. And when those questions do appear to you, feel free to send myself or any of the panelists an email today. Today, we are joined for part 2 of our 2-part series on disaster preparedness. And I cannot tell you how special of a gift this particular ministry is to our churches, from big to small. And it is an honor and a pleasure to be joined today by Katie Howe and Reverend Kelly Hansen, who are going to help us explore how loving our neighbor sometimes starts with being prepared for disasters. And so Katie and Kelly, I turn it over to you all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ellie. Hello, everyone. My name is Katie Howe, and I'm the Minister for Disaster Response and Recovery with the national setting of the United Church of Christ. and I'm joined today by Reverend Kelly Hansen, the Conference Disaster Response Coordinator in Kansas for the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference of the United Church of Christ. As the United Church of Christ, one of our key areas of focus around disaster ministries is long-term recovery, and the other one is disaster preparedness. By being well prepared for disasters before disaster strikes, we will be able to continue to show our love to our neighbors when disasters happen. Today's conversation is the second of a two-part series on disaster preparedness. Last week, we talked about how building community connections can facilitate long-term recovery in the community and can help mobilize resources faster in the event of a disaster. Today, we will be focusing a little bit more on disaster preparedness. And I'm going to share my screen. So I'd like to start the conversation today with our brand new resource, our Disaster Preparedness Guide for Local Churches, which is created as a workbook. And we'll put a link to this new workbook in the chat for you today. Genesis chapter 41, verses 35 and 36 says, "Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and lay grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine." Joseph was able to interpret Pharaoh's dream and saw that there would be a famine in the land of Egypt. With proper preparation, the people of Egypt were able to thrive throughout the famine and had enough to share with their neighbors. Jesus calls us to love our neighbors as ourselves. When disaster strikes, we turn to our neighbors. Preparing our churches and our communities are the best ways that we can care for our neighbors. It helps us to think about how we are caring for all of our neighbors when they need it the most. I want to start with a thank you as I had a team of volunteers from across the country that helped me with this important resource. And I hope that we have developed a tool that you will find helpful. I recognize that there is always more that we can do for local church preparedness, but I wanted to provide a resource of where to start. We recognize that all response to disaster happens locally. You are the experts in your own communities. The tools contained in this workbook are meant to be a starting point, and you can adjust them as you see appropriate. Oftentimes, these types of resources may seem very overwhelming, and this was created intentionally so steps 1 and 2 are intended for all churches, regardless of their human or financial resources. And then if your church feels that you have additional capacity, we have also included some additional suggestions on other types of disaster preparedness. Remember, the only key stakeholders are those in your church and in your wider community. You are not going to be answering to the association, the conference, or the national setting with this workbook. I also want to clarify what we are defining as a disaster. We define it as an occurrence of an event that suddenly and unexpectedly overwhelms a community's ability to respond. Disasters occur when vulnerable people are affected by hazards that cause human suffering or create human needs that require spiritual, monetary, material, or physical support. And these can be due to weather or geological events, pandemics, technological disasters, or human-caused disasters. We also acknowledge that a community's ability to respond after a disaster is affected by socioeconomics, and it's important to keep this in mind when engaging in long-term response. We have also shifted our focus from disaster-specific preparedness to what is considered an all-hazards approach. There are certain protective actions that your church community can take to prepare for all types of disasters. This means that rather than being prepared for tornadoes or flooding based on where you're located, there's a shift to being more prepared for everything because we don't know what types of disasters may impact our communities. This could be floods, tornadoes, wind, rain, wildfires, winter storms, gun violence, political violence, pandemics, environmental disasters, and the list continues on. The strategies contained in this workbook will help you prepare your church community, your church building, and your wider community for all types of environmental, technological, human-caused, and natural disasters. We also recognize that there are some communities that may be in the midst of disaster response right now, and it may feel a bit overwhelming to start a conversation around disaster preparedness during this time. However, we wanted to be sure to provide you with these resources as it's important to integrate preparedness for future disasters into your long-term recovery plans. When we think about implementing the plan, the most important point I will make is that you have to ensure you have a plan for updating it regularly. This could be integrating it into the life of the church, such as an annual meeting, maybe the first Sunday of hurricane season, one great hour of sharing Sunday, as that funding supports some of the work of disaster ministries. You can decide what makes the most sense for your congregation, but integrating it into the existing life of the church can be beneficial and ensure that it doesn't get set to the side. I also want to encourage you to have one individual who is very familiar with the plan and is in charge of implementing the plan. And no, this doesn't mean that this individual is required to implement the plan themselves. In fact, they should not be. But this individual understands the plans and knows how to delegate tasks appropriately. Okay, so now I suppose you're all thinking, this sounds great. And what is the plan? So I'm going to go through the checklist. And again, we'll put the link in the chat so you can find the link to the entire plan. But I just want to give you a brief overview for today. So this is what is called our disaster preparedness checklist. I understand the typing's a little small, but we are very intentional about keeping it to one page. So there are 2 steps that all churches should take regardless of their resources. Step 1 is considered basic preparedness, and this includes establishing a disaster team for your church. Maybe these individuals come from existing boards, or maybe you're creating a new team. Maybe it's the trustees and someone from your buildings and grounds and your security team. Whatever resources exist in your church, you can decide what makes sense. And then also collecting contact information for all people in your congregation. Many of our churches already do this, but when was the last time it was updated? And do you know who in your congregation may need assistance with sheltering in place or evacuating? And do you have emergency contacts for them? And who may need assistance in the event of an extended power outage? Some things to keep in mind when collecting this information. And then also creating a binder with crucial information for your congregation, church leadership, and your wider community. And there are templates for all of these in the workbook itself. And then step 2 includes preparing your church community and creating a communications plan. So the first thing that you need to know is, how do you gather all your information? In step 1, collect information, make sure it's all in one place. And step 2 is, how do you disseminate information? How do you get the information to the people who need it most in the event of a disaster? And then if you finished all of that and want to take more steps to be prepared, step 3 is about preparing your church building. Step 4 is about continuity of operations. And step 5 includes some consideration for future planning. And some of those topics include credentialing, installing solar panels, taking a community emergency response team training, compiling some food and water to keep at the church, starting conversations around what it would take to be an American Red Cross shelter, and creating an inventory of what is in your church. So I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Kelly Hansen, who is the Conference Disaster Response Coordinator located in Kansas for the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference. Kelly was on our team that helped to launch this workbook for you. So Reverend Kelly, if I'd like to turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Hansen. I am originally from Montana and now living in Kansas City. And Katie was asking me, I think one of the first and foremost things to share today is, why do I care about this? Why am I involved? What does disaster ministry mean to me? And, part of me says, I have no idea. I just feel compelled to do it. Starting way back when I first moved to Kansas City, I started volunteering to get training at another church denomination. I learned how to be a skid loader person. I learned how to use chainsaws. I took a CERT class at the local fire department. So I have my little green vest and hard hat. And all of this, I don't necessarily know the reason why, but I think part of it has to do with, I think I was around 13 and living in Montana, and we experienced a flood. My mom was a single mom. We had an extended family living situation out in the valley, and the Prickly Pear Creek flooded. We lived in a 500-year floodplain area. Nobody had floods. Montana, you're expecting a drought, and almost always is in a drought. And so she had just finished our basement. The carpet was new, the paneling was new, the drywall, everything was installed. And within a week, we had this crazy flood. And I was asking my mom some questions about it because as a teen, preteen, of course, I don't remember a whole lot other than wading across this huge river of water, going and staying with a friend of my mom's, not even thinking to bring clothes. We had to go shopping to have something dry to wear, which, lack of preparedness 101, right? And she said the reason that this in large part happened, besides a lot of extra rain, was that people that were upstream had not installed culverts under their driveways. So the water had nowhere to go. It all flowed downstream. We had these huge barrow pits on the sides of the road where we lived, and yet it still wasn't enough. And so I think of the repercussions of that. And then as a chaplain, as a hospital chaplain in my roles, I think of the fact that one of my responsibilities is to talk about medical power of attorney with people. I do this pretty regularly, and this is one of those things that everybody says we're going to do one of these days. We're going to get around to it. And by the time they see me, they were sure wishing they'd gotten it done. It is all about thinking about making decisions. What kind of decisions would you make about your health care if this happened, or if this happened, or if this happened? And not waiting until the last minute, because in my opinion and what I've seen is people do not make the best decisions in a crisis. They don't make the best decisions when they're in fear or they're sad or scared. And if we can kind of think through some of these things and have the information at hand, this really helps us to have a plan. This really helps us to be more responsive and do things more quickly. Be more efficient, be more effective. And my grandpa always said, work smart, not hard. So I think those all kind of come into play for me.
Thank you, Kelly. I think you really bring up the importance of doing this work ahead of time. And I think that there's a lot to be said. And sometimes it can feel really scary to talk about what would we do in the event of a worst case scenario, because it's almost admitting that the worst could happen. But it's really important to start these conversations and to figure out how to go from here. So I'd like to open it up for some questions. I know I kind of flew through some of the highlights of the plan, but we did include a chat in the link to it in the chat. I know Andrea's put it in the chat a few times. So just want to allow time to answer any questions that people have, and what parts of it you might want to learn a little bit more about. It is posted to our website, and won't be the first that you're hearing about this plan. There will be more coming about this plan in the future. So what questions do people have? There's a question in the chat. Does the UCC offer CERT training, or is that a local training? At the moment, the UCC does not offer CERT training. That's something that can typically be done through your local fire department. So I would encourage you to reach out to your local fire department or emergency management, and they would be able to help figure out how to get you plugged into that. CERT is Community Emergency Response Team.
Well, and just, I know too, FEMA has some online things that you can take online through the, and that is also helpful. Some of those trainings for efficiency
Correct.
and effectiveness.
Yes. an incident command system is also a great system to learn more about. And some of those links are also linked in the local church preparedness guide, kind of as a, if you want to learn more, here are some resources as well. What other questions do people have for today?
I have a question.
Go for
it. So what do you classify as a disaster? I asked because, Kelly had just talked about, doing some will, planning, that kind of stuff. I am an associate pastor at a church that is thinking about how to demystify hospice care, while also another group that is caring about, having a generator just in case electrical grid. So like all of that, what considers a disaster, or what is considered a disaster?
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen one more time. So this is the definition that we have come up with that we are calling a working definition. And hopefully you're seeing this definition on the screen. But so we're saying that a disaster is an occurrence or of an event that suddenly and unexpectedly overwhelms a community's ability to respond. Disasters occur when vulnerable people are affected by hazards that cause human suffering or create human needs that require spiritual, monetary, material, or physical support. And these can be due to weather or geological events, pandemics, technological disasters, or human-caused disasters. So we respond to, at the national setting, we respond to a variety of different types of events. This could be anything from floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires. We've done some response to shooting events. We've done some response to there was a train derailment here in Ohio a few years ago. This could be political violence. This could be environmental disaster, technological disaster. So anything that's really causing an occurrence of an event that suddenly and unexpectedly overwhelms a community's ability to respond. So something that is really overwhelming, that's really how I think about what a disaster is.
Yeah, and I had somebody, and thank you for that. I had somebody reach out and ask, well, what about COVID? COVID has impacted, their individual and collective abilities and stuff like that. What did disaster preparedness look like for our congregations during that time?
So disaster preparedness for our congregations looked a lot like there was a huge emotional and spiritual care component to COVID because people were socially distanced, people were away from their communities. So you have to remember that that's a big component of this work as well. It also, preparedness for things like COVID also include things like encouraging masking, encouraging social distancing, encouraging some of the key things that we've talked about in the lives of our church through disaster response and through the COVID response. So the national setting put out a variety of different resources that were related to COVID. And that was before my job here. But we were able to provide some resources for our local churches so that when disasters happen, they have the tools that they need to be able to make informed decisions to help their community.
And I see a question in the chat is, how do we get the workbook and checklist? If you could tell us that again, please.
So I just put the link in the chat again, but this is the link of where you will find a link to the workbook. It's intentionally created in a Word document, so you can edit it as easily as you can so that you can adapt it to fit your needs.
Well, and I think of disasters in our area in Kansas and Oklahoma as, for rural areas. I live in Kansas City, but most of our churches are rural, and in our conference, we have a lot of people who are in farm communities and ranching communities. One of our pastors is bivocational, and he shared about how many cattle he lost in one of the heat waves within the last couple of years. And this was before your time, Katie, but we talked to the national office, and she was encouraging them to consider to file for some of the grant resources, because that's a disaster. If you've lost 2,000 head of cows, that's a really pretty significant disaster. And maybe there's a whole community of ranchers who have lost that. We had that oil spill in a rural area in Kansas, and I have yet to hear from anybody about possible long-term recovery needs on that, because it is so rural. But I think that's one of those things to be mindful of. Or the gun violence, we experienced a shooting at the Kansas City Chiefs rally. We were aware of potential needs for that. And as someone who served as a capacity for a chaplain, specifically serving the population of survivors of gun violence, I can tell you that's a long-term recovery in and of itself. It requires some tangible resources, maybe to prevent people from getting back into a situation where gun violence is going to happen. It requires some spiritual and emotional support and counseling and PTSD or complex PTSD support. So those are all things that I don't think people think of. That they think of the tornado or the flood, but they don't think about some of those other things.
I see a question in the chat that says, what are your thoughts about collaboration for preparedness among churches and community service organizations in their respective area? I think it's great. I think it's really important to be able to build these community connections before disasters happen. This was some of the things that we touched on a little bit last week. So I want to encourage you to go back and watch last week's webinar as well. But there was a story out of Vermont where they had built these community coalitions during COVID. And then when a flood happened in their community, they were able to mobilize resources really quickly as community organizations, a lot faster than the state or the federal government were able to get them the support they needed. So I highly encourage reaching out to your communities, to other faith-based organizations, as well as community organizations, to see what resources may be available, and kind of just get your finger on the pulse of how do we get these community organizations together, and do a little bit of what I call asset mapping, of figuring out where the gaps are in your community before disasters happen.
I have a question for both you, Katie, and Kelly. I imagine in your positions, you have to be a little bit more forward thinking, meaning delving into the edge of disaster, trying to figure out all of the ways that disasters can be defined, and then how to take a step back and help to usher people through that. What is it that you are currently thinking about in regards to your own work, your own communities, that perhaps maybe we just haven't gotten a chance to think about in other worlds?
I think that for a long time, our disaster work has been very event focused rather than community focused. And so figuring out how to build resiliency more at the community level by building those community coalitions, by figuring out how churches can plug in to their communities a little bit better. I think that rather than looking at this thing has happened here, right now, thinking about the longer term strategy of how we can approach things, and from an all hazards approach is the model we're using now. So not just like how are we prepared for tornadoes, but how are we preparing our entire community for whatever disasters may happen? Because unfortunately, we live in a time where it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So just thinking about it from that perspective.
I think for me, I am still really very new, because I haven't had to, thankfully, respond and be actively engaged in a lot of this. But I think about a couple of things that I learned when we got together in Chicago and took a tour of downtown, I think it was downtown Chicago, and hearing about the experience of the flooding that happens over and over and over again, especially in particular neighborhoods of color and more marginalized or socioeconomically disadvantaged folks. And I kind of think about that in terms of, say, for example, Kansas City, where we've had a lot of redlining. And my manager was just telling me she was trying to report, she's doing a lot of work in her neighborhood to be proactive about getting curbs because she lives in an area where redlining had occurred. And so they don't have curbs. And then they found out this culvert that was under a road and they were taking pictures and it's cracked, and she tried to report it. And the response from the city was, well, what were you doing down there? It wasn't, well, let's take care of this. It was, why are you there? And so I'm connecting those two situations because Roger, I think it was talking about how there's not a lot of proactive thought to why don't we fix the problem so it doesn't keep flooding, as opposed to responding over and over and over to the same floods. And so there was conversation around how do we build resilience into our communities so that if we have to do this response, that we don't have to do it again. And that's kind of where I think is the other piece, is making sure people know that there are a lot of things that are disasters, and what does that look like to try and proactively prevent something like that aging community piece. And the fact that we have Helen that comes in and tries to help us understand on our disaster meetings, who are we not thinking about? The people that are otherly abled, or like Katie said, sheltering in place, and how are we proactively trying to minimize the damage or risk to those folks?
All right. I was just going to respond to, there was a comment in the chat about also thinking about medical emergencies and earthquakes as well. And I will note that in one of the recommendations is to make sure that you have posted by all of your exits so first of all, if you're a church that often keeps doors locked, because some of our churches have no one ever goes in and out this door, make sure that those are clearly marked for both for the people that are using your building, but also if emergency management needed to get in, or like EMS. And then also posted by all the exits should have the address of the church building, because you may not know the address of your church. You may just know that it's that church on the corner. But knowing like the exact address is really helpful. There's a line in there for noting where the closest Narcan might be located, or noting where the closest hospital is located, noting where the closest urgent care facility. I myself have been at a church and we were baking apple pies and someone had to go to urgent care because they sliced themselves with a knife. So it's important to know where these things are, because some of these things we just take for granted. And by creating an environment where you have all these things listed on the wall, I don't have to go searching for them. I don't have to track down someone who has lived there or has been attending that church for a long time. I can just be like, I know that we need to go to this urgent care. Let's go right now. So just thinking about those things in advance. So it's really helpful. And the intention is to adapt it in a way that works for you and your church community.
I love that too. Katie, I have one question for you. Where are there needs for disaster relief ministries at the national level? Because you and I get the 360 view, right? Where are there needs that where we aren't meeting right now? Like, are there states or conferences or associations that haven't been able to tap into this yet? And then how do we invite them into that space?
Yeah, so I oversee a network of conference disaster response coordinators. Kelly is one of them. So all of our conferences should have a conference disaster response coordinator, and some do and some don't. It just depends on where the conference is at. And so I'm working really hard with many of our conference ministers to start building capacity in some of the places that have had less capacity in the past. I really see this as a priority, making sure that there is at least some person in every conference, and ideally getting that person a conference disaster response team. So, it really shouldn't be one person who is volunteering to do all of the disaster response work, but really we want to get a variety of different people across the wider UCC engaged in disaster response work. Because as I mentioned earlier, for many of our communities, it's a matter of when, not if. And so how can we continue to build capacity in those places that maybe haven't had the capacity in the past?
Well, I think that those are the questions that I know that I have a ton more, but I want to be respectful of folks' times. And I think that uh, we're at a time, beloveds, when we have unique ways to revisit the ways in which we care for one another. Lots of things happening in our world simultaneously, from the interpersonal to the personal to the physical to the environmental to the political to the religious, the spiritual, all of these things, right? So we have a bunch of opportunities to really show up and care for one another. And I just am honored to have an organization, an institution, a faith community that offers such really special opportunities through the disaster relief ministries. And that's hard to say because it's disaster. Nobody wants to think of those times. But I want to thank both Reverend Kelly and Katie for joining us today. And I want to thank you all for joining us virtually today. And I hope that what was shared last Thursday and this Thursday helps to inform your work. And if you're curious about more, Katie's email address will be included in that follow-up email. Then, of course, mine. It comes from me. So I will have, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. I look forward to being with you all again on Monday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for another edition of our Nurture the Soul special offering, What's Next? We'll be exploring and having conversations, learning how to build community with faith practitioners from across the country. Sharon Fenema will be leading a small group of diverse faith practitioners from campus settings, church settings, community organizing, and even our board settings. We had those folks come together and meet through a gathering of people to explore racial justice. So we'll hear from them through their personal accounts and stories, how they've attended to sacred self-care in these complicated and diverse settings, how they develop strategies and skills for sustaining themselves in their professional and personal work, how they confronted their fears personally and collectively in order to model what authentic relationships of trust across our divided nation could look like. And how all of that has led to an imagination and a practice of what a just world for all looks and feels like, and accompanying that is with a deep admiration and a sustaining kinship for one another. And so I look forward to being with you all virtually on Monday. But before we go, Katie, can you give us a benediction and take us out?
Yes. Let us pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for gathering us here in this virtual space together today. We ask for your guidance as we continue to show your love in our communities through disaster preparedness and response. Empower us as we engage in this important work and as we continue to show our love to our neighbors and continue to show your love to our neighbors. Go in peace. Amen.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.